December 2006. Britain makes its final payment. 61 years, 2 generations, $7.5 billion wired to Washington. The final installment on a loan that was supposed to be a bailout. A loan that was supposed to help rebuild after the greatest war in human history. A loan that instead destroyed the largest empire the world had ever seen and handed the United States global dominance on a silver platter. But here's what they don't teach you in school. This wasn't an accident. It was the plan all along. $31 billion in Lend-Lease supplies. That's $690 billion in today's money. Ships, planes, tanks, food, oil, everything Britain needed to survive the Nazi onslaught. Only it wasn't free. Never had been free. And the final bill came with Germany's surrender. August 1945, Japan surrenders. On August 21, 1945, President Truman signs the executive order. Lend-Lease ends. Immediately. Not next month. Not after Britain recovers. Now. Ships offshore turned around. Contracts were canceled overnight. Britain, still rationing food, still rebuilding bombed-out cities, still maintaining troops on a quarter of the globe, suddenly found itself cut off from the world, financially suffocated. And Washington knew exactly what it was doing. This is the story of the greatest economic heist in modern history. How America exploited Britain's desperate need to survive Hitler to destroy British power forever. How credit became a noose, how aid became conquest, and how the world we live in today, the dollar-dominated world order, the American century, was built on the financial corpse of the British Empire. By the end of this video, you'll understand how this scheme works, because it's the same scheme America has used dozens of times since. Same script. Lend them money, impose conditions, wait for a crisis, extract concessions, become a hegemon. And right now, we're seeing it playing out again with other countries. Different goals, same strategy. Let me show you the scheme. Then I'll prove its validity using British documents. Then you'll understand why this is more important than ever. Stage 1. Dependency. Create a situation where another nation absolutely needs your resources to survive. War is perfect. Natural disaster works. Economic crisis, ideal. The target must be desperate enough that they'll accept any terms just to stay alive. Stage 2, the loan. Provide what they need, but structure it as debt with conditions attached. On the surface, it looks generous. Low interest rates, long repayment terms. But buried in the fine print, demands that reshape their entire economic system to benefit you. Stage 3, the squeeze. The moment the immediate crisis passes, cut off the support, demand payment, enforce the conditions. Watch them struggle. Watch their currency collapse. Watch their influence crumble. Offer more loans with worse terms to keep them afloat, just barely enough that they have to keep complying. Stage 4, the extraction. Take everything. Their markets, their resources, their geopolitical position, their empire. And when they finally pay off the debt decades later, they're no longer a rival. They're a client state. Mission accomplished. This isn't theory. This is exactly what happened to Britain between 1941 and 1956, and I can prove it using their own treasury documents. September 1939. Britain declares war on Germany. Winston Churchill knows the math. Britain cannot win alone. British gold reserves, $4.5 billion. Cost of fighting Germany, estimated at $15 billion annually. Britain will be bankrupt in months. Churchill's strategy: survive long enough for America to enter the war. But how do you survive when you can't afford bullets? The answer came from Franklin Roosevelt, and it was brilliant. Lend-Lease. March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act passes Congress. America will provide Britain everything needed to fight: ships, planes, tanks, ammunition, food, steel, oil, medical supplies, everything. The sales pitch to the American public: we're not going to war, we're just lending our friends some tools. We'll get it all back when the war ends. Britain doesn't have to pay now, they'll settle up later. Sounds generous. Here's what Roosevelt actually said to his cabinet. Quote, "This war is going to bankrupt Britain. When that happens, we'll be able to dictate terms." Not might be able to, will be able to. This is documented in the Morgenthau diaries. Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, writing in 1941 about the deliberate strategy to use Britain's desperation to supplant British economic power permanently. By 1945, Britain had received $31 billion in Lend-Lease supplies. That's $690 billion today. Britain's entire GDP in 1945 was $20 billion. Think about that ratio. America provided Britain with aid equal to 155% of Britain's entire annual economic output. Britain became completely dependent. Every bullet fired at the Germans, American-made. Every bomber flying over Berlin, American-built. Every meal feeding British soldiers, American grain. Roosevelt created total dependency. And the moment that dependency was complete, the trap closed. August 15, 1945. Japan surrenders. World War II is over. August 21, 1945. 6 days later, President Truman signs Executive Order 9610. Lend-Lease terminated, effective immediately. Britain still has troops in Germany, Italy, Greece, India, Malaysia, Hong Kong, across Africa. Still rationing food at home. Still rebuilding cities. Still demobilizing 5 million soldiers. And America just cut off the money. British Treasury panicking. Without American supplies, Britain's economy will collapse within weeks. They send John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of the generation, to Washington. Negotiate something, anything, get more time. Keynes arrives in Washington September 1945 expecting gratitude. Britain fought Hitler for 2 years alone before America entered. British cities were bombed. British civilians died. Surely America will help its closest ally rebuild. What Keynes encounters instead is a calculated dismantling operation. The American negotiating team is clear. Britain wants more money? Fine. Here are the terms. First, $3.75 billion loan at 2% interest. Start repaying in 1951. Seems reasonable until you read the conditions. Condition 1. Immediate convertibility of the pound sterling. Within 1 year of the loan's activation, Britain must make the pound fully convertible to dollars at a fixed rate. No capital controls, no restrictions. Anyone holding pounds can exchange them for dollars on demand. Keynes immediately understands this is a death sentence. Britain just fought a 6-year war. The economy is shattered. Exports are minimal. Imports are massive. The pound is overvalued. If Britain makes the pound convertible, every international holder will immediately dump pounds for dollars. Britain's currency reserves will evaporate. The pound will collapse. And Britain will have to beg for another loan on worse terms. Keynes argues this. He explains the economics. He pleads for a 5-year transition period. The Americans refuse. 1 year, non-negotiable. Condition 2. End imperial preference immediately. Imperial preference, the system where British Empire members trade with each other at preferential rates. Lower tariffs within the empire, higher tariffs on American goods. This system kept the British economic bloc together. It gave Britain leverage. The Americans demand it ends immediately. Britain must open all empire markets to American goods on equal terms. Translation: America gets free access to a quarter of the world's markets. Markets Britain fought for centuries to control. Markets Britain just fought 6 years to defend. Now, handed to Washington, Because Britain is broke. Condition 3. Britain must support the Bretton Woods system. The new international monetary order, where the dollar, not the pound, is the global reserve currency, where the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, controlled by Washington, dictate economic policy globally. Britain must help dismember its own financial supremacy. Keynes fights for months. He gets nothing. December 6, 1945. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement is signed. Britain gets $3.75 billion plus $650 million in additional Lend-Lease settlement at 2% annual interest. In exchange, Britain agrees to destroy the economic foundations of its empire within 1 year. Keynes returns to London physically and emotionally shattered. He tells colleagues, quote, "We negotiated like paupers." He dies 4 months later, age 62, exhausted. Some historians believe the stress of the negotiations contributed to his death. He saw what was coming. He couldn't stop it. July 15, 1947. Britain makes the pound convertible as required. Exactly what Keynes feared happens immediately. Money floods out of Britain. International holders dump pounds for dollars. In 3 weeks, Britain loses $1 billion in currency reserves, a quarter of the entire loan gone in 21 days. August 20, 1947. Britain suspends convertibility. The agreement is in shambles. The pound is in crisis. Britain is bankrupt again. But here's the part they don't tell you. Where did the loan money actually go? Not into rebuilding British factories, not into housing British civilians, not into repairing British infrastructure. Into maintaining the empire. Keynes himself, in negotiations, admitted Britain was spending £2 billion annually on colonial administration and military forces across the empire. That's more than half the loan. Britain borrowed American money to keep controlling India, Malaysia, Kenya, Egypt, Palestine. Washington knew this. They planned for it, because while Britain was burning through American loans maintaining colonies, those colonies were growing restless. India demanding independence, Palestine in revolt, Malaysia fighting communist insurgents, Egypt wanting British troops out. And Britain couldn't afford to hold them anymore. The squeeze was working perfectly. Britain needed more money. Britain had no leverage, so Britain would have to liquidate assets, and the Americans were ready to pick up the pieces. 1947. India and Pakistan gain independence. Britain's crown jewel, gone. 1948. Britain abandons Palestine, creates the disaster we're still dealing with today but can't afford to maintain the mandate. 1952. Egypt forces Britain out of Suez. 1957. Ghana independent. 1960. Nigeria independent. 1963. Kenya independent. The empire collapses in 15 years. Every single loss directly traceable to Britain's inability to finance imperial defense because they're drowning in American loan obligations and can't make their currency work and can't compete in their own markets anymore because American goods are flooding in under the conditions they were forced to accept. But it gets worse. Because while Britain is liquidating the empire to service American debt, America is consolidating exactly what Britain lost. 1947, the Truman Doctrine. America commits to defending Greece and Turkey against communism. 2 countries Britain can no longer afford to protect. Britain withdraws. America steps in. Eastern Mediterranean, now an American lake. 1948, the Marshall Plan. $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. That's $180 billion today. But here's what's interesting. The Marshall Plan includes Britain. Britain receives $3.2 billion, more than any other country. Sounds generous, until you realize Britain is forced to use that money to buy American goods, open markets to American companies, and align foreign policy with Washington. The Marshall Plan wasn't charity, it was market capture. American corporations flood European markets. American military bases established across the continent. American economic model imposed everywhere. And Britain, desperate for the money, has to go along with it. 1949, NATO established. Britain is a founding member. But who dominates NATO? Who provides most of the troops, most of the equipment, most of the funding? America. Britain goes from leading a global empire to being a junior partner in an American-led alliance. 1956, Suez Crisis, the final humiliation. Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel invade to take it back. It's a military success. They capture the canal. Then Eisenhower makes a phone call. America threatens to dump British bonds, collapse the pound, and destroy Britain's economy unless they withdraw immediately. Britain withdraws. In defeat. Unable to conduct foreign policy without American permission. The message is clear. Britain is no longer a great power. Britain is an American client state. And if they forget that, Washington will remind them by destroying their currency. This is the extraction phase. Britain's global position, gone. Britain's empire, dissolved. Britain's markets, opened to American competition. Britain's currency, subordinate to the dollar. Britain's foreign policy, aligned with Washington, or else. And all of it structured so that Britain would keep paying, keep owing, keep dependent. December 2006. Britain makes the final payment, $83 million, the last installment on a loan taken in 1946 to survive after defeating Hitler. 61 years of payments. $7.5 billion transferred to Washington when you add it all up, for a loan that was supposed to be aid. But the real cost wasn't the money. The real cost was everything Britain gave up to get that money. The empire, the currency, the independence. And America extracted every ounce. This isn't ancient history. This is the playbook. And America has run this exact play dozens of times since 1946. South Korea in the 1980s. IMF loans with conditions that opened Korean markets to American firms. Mexico in 1994. NAFTA and loans that destroyed Mexican manufacturing and made Mexico dependent on American supply chains. Greece in 2010. Eurozone bailouts with austerity conditions that privatized Greek assets and handed them to international capital. The pattern is always the same. Create dependency through crisis. Provide loans with conditions. Enforce conditions when they try to resist. Extract assets, markets, and geopolitical position. Emerge as hegemon. And right now, we're watching it again. China's Belt and Road Initiative is literally trying to run the same playbook on developing nations. Loan them money for infrastructure. Attach conditions. Wait for debt crisis. Extract concessions. Except China learned from watching America do it to Britain. And America is scrambling to counter it because they recognize their own strategy being used against their interests. But here's the thing. This pattern only works if you don't see it coming, if you don't understand the structure, if you think loans are just loans and aid is just aid. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and you start asking different questions. When the IMF offers a country a bailout, what conditions are attached? When America provides military aid, what policy concessions are required? When China offers to build a port, who actually controls it when the debt comes due? The British Empire fell because British leaders thought America was an ally providing friendly assistance. They didn't see the trap until it closed, and by then, it was too late. The loan was signed. The conditions were binding. The empire was finished. This isn't speculation. This is documented in Britain's own archives. The National Archives at Kew hold the complete Treasury files from the Lend-Lease negotiations and the 1946 loan. Keynes's notes. cabinet memos, letters between Churchill and Roosevelt. It's all there. August 1945. British Treasury memo estimates Britain needs $5 billion minimum to avoid economic collapse. America offers $3.75 billion, deliberately insufficient, ensuring Britain will need more loans later on worse terms. September 1945. Keynes's negotiation notes describe American demands as economic warfare disguised as friendship. He writes that the convertibility clause will destroy the pound within a year. He's right. December 1945. Cabinet debates whether to reject the loan and try to survive independently. Chancellor Hugh Dalton argues Britain has no choice. Quote, "We are facing economic collapse. We either accept American terms or face revolution." They accept. July 1947. Bank of England reports show exactly what happens when convertibility is activated. $700 million in reserves lost in the first week. $300 million more in the second week. The governor writes, quote, "This is not market forces. This is organized economic warfare." 1952. Treasury review of the loan concludes Britain would have recovered faster without it if they'd imposed capital controls, maintained imperial preference, and rebuilt independently. But by then, it's too late. The empire is dissolving. The commitments are binding. These documents are public record. You can go read them yourself. The British government was aware they were being economically conquered. They saw it happening in real time. They just couldn't stop it because they were bankrupt and desperate, and America held all the leverage. That's how the pattern works. It doesn't require conspiracy. It just requires one side having resources and using them strategically to reshape the system in their favor, while the other side is too weak to resist. Today, American politicians and British politicians love to talk about the special relationship, the deep bond between America and Britain, shared values, shared history, shared interests. And there is genuine cultural connection, language, law, democratic traditions, but economically and geopolitically, the special relationship is code for Britain does what America wants. Britain joined the Iraq War in 2003 despite massive public opposition because Tony Blair couldn't say no to Washington. Britain left the European Union partly because it couldn't reconcile European integration with American alignment. Britain's foreign policy has been essentially subordinate to American interests for 70 years. That didn't happen by accident. That's the direct result of the economic conquest that occurred between 1945 and 1956. Britain became dependent. Britain stayed dependent. And that dependency shaped everything. The Anglo-American loan wasn't aid. It was the instrument of transfer. The transfer of global supremacy from London to Washington, from the pound to the dollar, from the British Empire to the American century. And Britain paid for the privilege of its own dispossession for 61 years. This isn't just about history. This is about pattern recognition, about understanding how power actually works. Because the same dynamics play out at every level. Loans are never just loans when there's a power imbalance. Whether it's a country, a company, or an individual, debt creates leverage for the creditor, and that leverage gets used to reshape the debtor's choices, their opportunities, their future. The person who controls the money controls the terms, and the terms are always structured to benefit the person providing the money. Not through malice necessarily, but through incentive structure. If you loan someone money, you want repayment. You want security. You want conditions that ensure you get paid. And those conditions inevitably constrain the borrower's freedom. Britain thought they were borrowing from an ally. They were actually borrowing from a rival who saw an opportunity to become the hegemon. And the structure of the debt ensured that outcome. It wasn't about the interest rate. It was about the conditions: convertibility, market access, policy alignment. The same logic applies everywhere. When you borrow, you're not just getting money, you're accepting conditions, that will reshape your options. The question is whether those conditions serve your interests or someone else's. Britain's leaders in 1946 were desperate. They needed money to survive. They didn't have the luxury of refusing. But they also didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to until it was too late. Keynes understood, but Keynes couldn't stop it alone. The lesson is this: understand the structure before you sign. Understand the conditions before you borrow. Understand the leverage before you create dependency. Because debt isn't neutral. Debt is a power relationship, and the person holding the debt holds the power. America understood this in 1945. Britain learned it the hard way. And every country since has had to navigate the same reality. Borrow from the hegemon, accept the hegemon's terms, become part of the hegemon's system. That's not capitalism. That's not free markets. That's strategic use of financial leverage to reshape global power. And it works. Britain in 1900 controlled a quarter of the earth. Britain in 2025 is a mid-sized European economy with delusions of grandeur and an oversized financial sector that mostly serves American interests. That transformation didn't happen because of war. It happened because of loans, because of debt, because of conditions attached to money that Britain desperately needed and America strategically provided. The empire fell not to German bombs, but to American bankers. And the entire process was structured to look like friendship and assistance, while actually being conquest and extraction. One more critical point. The timing of Lend-Lease termination was deliberately chosen for maximum leverage. August 21, 1945. Why then? Japan had just surrendered August 15th. The war was over. Britain had no more immediate crisis requiring American support. But Britain still had massive commitments: troops overseas, occupied Germany, colonial unrest, reconstruction needs. If Truman had continued Lend-Lease for even 6 more months, Britain could have drawn down forces, negotiated colonial transitions, stabilized the economy, and approached the loan negotiations with more leverage. Instead, Truman cut everything immediately. Britain had to come to Washington within weeks, completely desperate, willing to accept any terms. That's not accident. That's strategy. The same timing dynamic shows up in every crisis loan. The IMF doesn't offer bailouts when countries are merely struggling. They wait until the country is in freefall, currency collapsing, default imminent. Then they offer the loan. With conditions. Because desperate borrowers accept terms that rational borrowers would refuse. Greece in 2010. The Eurozone crisis. Greece needed 110 billion euros. The EU and IMF waited until Greek bonds were collapsing, banks were failing, riots in the streets. Then they offered the money, with austerity conditions that destroyed the Greek economy for a decade. Because Greece had no choice: accept the terms or face total collapse. Britain in 1945 faced the exact same choice: accept American terms or face economic implosion. There was no third option. America made sure of that by cutting Lend-Lease at precisely the moment Britain was most vulnerable. That's how you conquer without firing a shot. You wait for weakness. You create dependency. You time the assistance to maximize leverage. You extract concessions. You consolidate gains. And 20 years later, nobody even remembers it was conquest, because it looked like loans and treaties and friendly agreements. Before World War II, the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. International trade was denominated in pounds. Central banks held pounds as reserves. The City of London was the financial capital of the world. Britain's economic power rested on the pound's dominance. By 1960, the dollar had completely replaced the pound. Why? Not because American economy was necessarily more productive, not because American institutions were necessarily better, because America used Britain's wartime desperation to restructure the entire international monetary system with the dollar at the center. Bretton Woods, 1944. The agreement that created the IMF and World Bank and established the dollar as the reference currency for international exchange. Britain was at the table. Keynes was there negotiating. But Britain had no leverage. Britain needed American money to survive, so Britain agreed to a system that dethroned the pound and enthroned the dollar. Then, the 1946 loan conditions forced Britain to make the pound convertible before the British economy could handle it. The convertibility crisis of 1947 shattered confidence in the pound permanently. International holders learned the pound was vulnerable. They shifted to dollars. The transition accelerated. By the 1950s, central banks worldwide were dumping pound reserves and buying dollars, not because they wanted to, because the structure of the system made dollars safer. And that structure was deliberately created by American negotiators in 1944 and 1946 to ensure dollar dominance. Britain fought this. The sterling area, a bloc of countries that continued using pounds for trade, persisted into the 1960s. But it slowly crumbled. One by one, countries shifted to dollars because the international system favored dollars, because oil was priced in dollars, because the IMF and World Bank used dollars, because America was the hegemon, and the hegemon's currency becomes the reserve currency. The pound's fall and the dollar's rise were two sides of the same coin. America engineered both, and the mechanism was debt. Britain borrowed dollars. Britain had to earn dollars to repay. Britain had to align policy with Washington to access dollars. And gradually, Britain became locked into a dollar-dominated system where British interests were secondary to maintaining access to American finance. That's the ultimate extraction. Not just wealth, not just territory, currency supremacy. The ability to print money that the entire world must use and hold and accept. That privilege, called seigniorage, gives the hegemon enormous power. They can run deficits indefinitely. They can impose sanctions by cutting off access to the currency. They can fund military operations by printing money that others must accept. Britain had that power in 1900. America took it by 1960. And the mechanism was the loans and conditions imposed on Britain when Britain was too weak to resist. Here's what keeps me up at night. If this happened to Britain, the most powerful empire in human history, what happens when America's turn comes? Because every hegemon eventually faces this moment. Rome collapsed. Spain collapsed. France collapsed. Britain collapsed. Every single one thought they were permanent. Every single one believed their supremacy was natural and eternal. Every single one was wrong. America has been the global hegemon for 75 years. That's a long run historically. But the dollar's dominance rests on the same foundations Britain's pound dominance rested on: international acceptance, economic strength, military power, and, critically, the lack of a rival with enough leverage to impose conditions. China is now the world's second-largest economy. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. China is creating alternative financial systems: the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, digital yuan pilots for international trade, all designed to reduce dependence on the dollar system. What happens if America faces a crisis and needs to borrow from China? What conditions would China impose? What policy concessions would America have to make? Would American leaders recognize the trap Britain fell into? Or would desperation force acceptance just like it did for Britain? I don't know the answer, but I know the pattern. And the pattern suggests that hegemons don't stay hegemons forever. Eventually, overextension, debt, rivals, and crisis combine to create vulnerability. And vulnerability creates leverage for whoever has resources. Britain in 1945 believed America was an ally. America was. But America was also a rival seizing an opportunity. and the opportunity was too perfect to pass up. Britain was desperate. America was rich. The entire global order was being restructured, and whoever controlled the money would control the outcome. America controlled the money. America got the outcome. Britain paid for it for 61 years. The question isn't whether America will eventually face a similar moment. Historically, it's inevitable. The question is whether Americans will recognize it when it happens, or whether, like Britain, they'll think they're getting aid from a friend and only realize decades later they were being conquered by a rival. Economic warfare is more effective than military warfare because nobody recognizes it as warfare. Bombs and invasions are obvious. Everyone knows they're being attacked. They resist, they fight back, they remember. But loans? Loans look like help, especially in crisis. When your economy is collapsing, when your people are starving, when you need money desperately, a loan looks like salvation. You're grateful. You sign willingly. You don't realize you just surrendered your sovereignty until years later, when you're trapped servicing debt and can't pursue independent policy without permission from your creditors. Britain was grateful for Lend-Lease in 1941. Britain was grateful for the 1946 loan. British leaders thanked American leaders publicly. The special relationship was celebrated. Nobody called it conquest. Nobody called it economic warfare. It was friendly Allied assistance during and after the greatest war in history. Except it wasn't. It was the strategic use of financial leverage to dismantle a rival empire and transfer global supremacy. And it worked perfectly. So perfectly that Britain kept paying for 61 years while thinking the relationship was mutually beneficial. That's the genius of economic conquest. The conquered don't resist because they don't realize they've been conquered. They think they're partners. Junior partners, maybe, but partners. They don't understand the structure locked them into subordination permanently until it's far too late to do anything about it. Every American should understand this history. Not to feel guilty, not to apologize, but to recognize the pattern. Because the same strategy used against Britain gets used by every rising power against every declining power. It's not uniquely American. It's not even uniquely modern. It's how power transitions happen in financial age. Rome extracted tribute from conquered provinces. Spain extracted gold from the New World. Britain extracted resources from the empire. America extracted economic supremacy from Britain using loans and conditions. China is trying to extract influence from developing countries using Belt and Road debt. The mechanism changes, the pattern persists, and the only defense is understanding the pattern before you're trapped in it. Understanding that loans aren't neutral, conditions aren't standard. Desperation clouds judgment. And whoever controls the money controls the outcome. Britain's leaders in 1946 didn't have the luxury of refusing, but they also didn't fully understand what they were accepting. If they had, they might have chosen differently. Imposed capital controls, maintained imperial preference, defaulted on Lend-Lease obligations, gone independent, even if it meant short-term pain. Would it have worked? Maybe, maybe not. But it would have been a choice made with full understanding, rather than a trap walked into blindly. That's the lesson. Understand the structure, recognize the leverage, see the pattern, and make decisions with eyes open rather than accepting terms you'll regret for generations because you were desperate and didn't understand what you were signing. The Anglo-American loan wasn't aid. It was the death certificate of the British Empire. Written in financial language, signed willingly, enforced ruthlessly. Paid for over 61 years, and celebrated as friendship the entire time. That's how you conquer in the modern world. Not with armies, with loans. Not with invasion, with conditions. Not with occupation, with debt that lasts longer than any military occupation ever could. Britain finally paid off the loan in 2006. But Britain never recovered what they lost in exchange for that loan. The empire is gone. The pound is subordinate. The special relationship means doing what Washington wants, and it all traces back to those negotiations in 1945 and 1946, when desperate British diplomats agreed to American terms because they had no choice and didn't fully understand the consequences. 61 years of payments, 2 generations, $7.5 billion. The final bill for defeating Hitler. Except Britain defeated Hitler in 1945. What Britain paid for until 2006 was their own economic conquest by their closest ally. If this opened your eyes to how power actually works, subscribe now, because what I've shown you about Britain is just one example of a pattern that's playing out everywhere. The debt trap, the conditions, the extraction. China's doing it. The IMF's doing it. Private equity's doing it at corporate level. Same playbook, different scale. In the next video, I'll show you the modern version. How IMF structural adjustment programs destroyed economies across Africa and Latin America. How the Asian financial crisis of 1997 was manipulated to transfer assets to Western capital. How the 2008 bailouts restructured entire industries to benefit the same banks that caused the crisis. All following the exact same 4-stage pattern. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment below. Did you know Britain was still paying off World War II debt until 2006? What surprised you most about this story? Let's discuss in the comments, because understanding this pattern is the first step to not getting trapped by it yourself. The window for financial independence is closing. Not because some guru says so, because the pattern keeps repeating. And the people who see it early don't just survive the next crisis, they position themselves to thrive.